Okay, welcome everybody to the Capital City College Group Sales Academy Wednesday webinar series. As you know, these are going to be a series of webinars based on various elements of practical selling and what sales means in the modern era. So we'll be sharing lots of techniques and strategies and skills with you that you can start to apply now in your everyday sales day-to-day sales activity. And it doesn't matter what you sell. This is kind of a generic overview. We won't be pushing any one kind of particular sales model, and it doesn't really matter what industry you're in, although I will say if anything, maybe these series are going to be slightly geared more towards professional sales or B2B sales, more so than that transactional B2C, like dealing with customers, so to speak. There will still be some principles that you can take away, but this is probably more geared to you if you're in the B2B arena and you provide a service and product to other businesses. Now, we will be getting into some techniques and strategies, but first I would like to start covering the psychology of modern selling, and that means we're going to be looking at some core principles that really apply to sales today and what sales means today, and likely give an indication of what sales will mean tomorrow. Some overarching principles that will be useful for you to take away and start to embed into your practice. And along the way, we'll also be looking to bust some sales myths. Sales myths being things you have been told about sales which are simply not true, or they may have been true at one point, but they're no longer relevant. So a general overview of today will be to understand the evolution of selling, how selling has changed from 30, 20, 10, even 5 years ago, and sales will continue to change. So we need to have an understanding of that process and what is happening there and why selling is changing. And once we understand that, we can then start to learn different modes of communication, and there's three in particular that in communication, influence and persuasion have been dictated to be either more effective or less effective. So whenever we communicate with someone, we're generally finding ourselves communicating in one of these three modes or one of these three patterns, and you might be surprised to find how ill-effective maybe your current mode of communication is. We'll be looking to, as I said earlier, to understand a number of principles, 5 principles that will help your sales conversations stand apart from traditional salespeople. I think that's really important. We're in a very busy marketplace at the minute. It doesn't matter what you sell or who you sell it to. Chances are that there's a lot of noise in the marketplace or in your industry, and we need to do everything we can to stand apart from those traditional salespeople that, as you'll learn very shortly, our customers and our audiences have learned to not trust and kind of not put faith in. So we need to put ourselves on a bit of a pedestal and be better than that. And in order to do that, there's 5 principles I'd like you to learn and take away. And I think to help you do that will be, as I said before, dispelling some commonly told myths about sales practice and what it means to be in sales. We're told some things about how we should behave and what we should think, and I would argue that they're not relevant. So I think that might be of interest to you guys. So without further ado, I do want to start by looking at the evolution of selling, and I suppose that means we have to go back. Let's look 20 plus years ago. So 20, the 20 plus years ago is 2000. Some in my mind, maybe I'm getting on. I still think of the 90s or 80s, but let's go back to the beyond 20 years then and look at the 70s, 80s, 90s. We've been selling since the dawn of time, but if we go back to that kind of era, here's a question for you: what was the primary source of information that a customer would have to go to if they were considering making a purchase of a product or service? So 20 years ago, if you were looking to purchase something, where would you go to find information about a particular product and service? Well, invariably, you're going to end up talking to a sales representative of a company. Okay, you're going to have to go into a store, into a branch. You're going to have to come into contact with a salesperson because they held all the information about products or service. And because of that, they kind of had control over the sales process. They were in control, and they had the kind of the power over the sales cycle because you'd kind of have to speak to them. So they kind of had leverage over the consumer. Consumer didn't have anywhere else to go. And of course, I'm talking before the internet, right? But today, of course, that's not the case. In the present day, we do have the internet. We have technology, very easily accessible. And with it comes multiple streams of information for us to find out about our products and services. So we can Google anything. And we often do when we're considering making a purchase about something. If you want to investigate whether it's a good choice, we can Google any company in the world to find out about them. We can check out social media, which will tell us a lot about the customer experiences. It will give us Comparisons, there's comparison websites out there, so we can see pricing, we can see how they compare in features and benefits. We can check out competitors very, very easily. We don't need to make multiple phone calls now. We can quite easily compare products. And that image there as well at the bottom is actually meant to reflect referrals. So referrals have always been part of sales, but we can actually get referrals and testimonials and reviews from people we don't even know. So there's things like Trustpilot where, if you look at a product and it's only got 3 out of 5 stars, you're going to question it when it's put alongside the one that has 5 out of 5 stars. So we can now tap into other people's experiences. And that's not just us as a customer. We have to understand that if we are selling a product, our customers have access to this as well. They are going out there and they are finding out stuff about your product before they even speak to you. They can find out everything. They can find out how long you've been in business, what you sell, your pricing for the most part about it. And they can even get personal and find out about you. If you have an online presence and you are in the B2B market, do not be surprised if people are checking out your online presence. If you're active on things like on LinkedIn or anything like that, they may well be looking at who they're dealing with, particularly if you're dealing with high-end sales. Okay, so I want you to understand that we're in a very, very different era now, and with this, what compounds this effect is also that we are in something that I like to call the post-trust era, meaning that we simply don't trust salespeople as much as we might have done 30, 40 years ago, if we even did back then. A number of reasons for that. There's been banking crises, there's been a number of scandals that kind of, unfortunately, the few have ruined it for the many. But salespeople aren't held in a particular high light, as you probably understand. Now, if you weren't aware of that, then you might be interested to know that there was a study done many, many years ago by Daniel H. Pink, the author of To Sell Is to Human. It's an awesome book, and I do suggest you read it. And one of the findings of his research is they went out to thousands of consumers across the globe, and they asked them this question: what's the first word that pops into mind when you think of a salesperson? What's the first word that pops into mind when you think of a salesperson? And the results were what you see in front of you. Okay. Now, you'll be surprised well, you may not be surprised to find that there's not many glamorous words in there. They kind of all like have a negative connotation to it. Now, the larger the word, the more people said it. Okay, so the larger, so you can see that a lot of people put pushy, sleazy, and hard, and a couple of people might have put ugh. Okay, this isn't the whole list. There's lots more, but I'll be honest with you, they're all kind of looking at salespeople in the same way. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of trust here. So if you ask thousands of people what they think of salespeople, this is kind of how we're described, and that's not very empowering if you are in the sales profession, as you will be if you're watching this. Okay, that this is kind of what the majority think of us. Okay, now this study was also found out something really interesting in its research about how salespeople perceive themselves, or I suppose more so their abilities. So they asked salespeople how comfortable they feel using traditional selling techniques. So techniques that we'll explore later, but how many salespeople actually feel comfortable selling, and selling in the way that they have been trained to sell. Generally, you walk into a sales job with no experience and you are left under the wing of a sales manager or team leader that may have been promoted above his capacity to lead or manage or train, and they'll just impart on you their kind of understanding of sales, which has come from above. So there's like this domino effect, this chain of poor habits and practice that runs down the chain of evolution. And it's not our fault that we're being told to sell in this way, but 82% of us don't like it. 82% of us, 4 out of 5 salespeople, do not enjoy using the techniques they are taught to use when engaging customers. And I think that's quite staggering, because that's basically the way I see that, is that more than 80% of people believe they're ineffective at their jobs, and likely are. Okay, if you're not feeling comfortable using the traditional selling techniques, or any selling techniques for that matter, do you think that your prospects can feel that when you're on the phone to them, or when you're face to face with them, when you go in for that kind of cheesy close or whatever it might be, that they can feel that you're uncomfortable? You bet they can. Okay, so that might be interesting. Maybe you consider yourself to be one of those 82%. You think, yeah, actually, I don't enjoy selling using some of the techniques I've been told to. It makes me feel a bit uneasy. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're in that 18% that say, no, I don't mind the techniques. It really doesn't matter which you are, but I think you'll all agree that it's quite a surprisingly high number of people who kind of have this inside thinking that actually the way I'm selling isn't right, it's not ethical, it's not effective, or whatever it might be. So moving on from that, we need to, now that we kind of understand a little bit more about the psychology of, you know, ourselves to some degree, and how we don't feel comfortable, I want to share with you the psychology of the buyers and look at some consumers' behaviors. So that when we talk about traditional selling techniques, these are some of the terms that you may have come across: assumptive selling, alternative closing, feel, felt, found method, maybe some of these, and there's more, there's, you know, list goes on, but these are some of the traditional selling techniques that just maybe they had their place in time 20, 30 years ago, but I would argue that that is not the case now. Okay, so we need to kind of get rid of those, okay, and move on to better things. So to support the kind of techniques and approach that we should be using, we need to look at the psychology of the buyer. And to do that, I want to refer you to some stats and data from Salesforce, who conducted a comprehensive study in 2012 that found out a couple of interesting things. One was that there's 90% of decision makers will not respond to cold calls. 90% of decision makers will not respond to cold calls, which is quite interesting when in my line of work I see a lot of businesses still using cold calling, or they might call it prospecting, as their main kind of frontline prospecting tool. Okay, they'll continue to cold call, they'll continue to, and I'm not saying cold calling is dead, by the way, but when we look at 90% of decision makers are actively not responding to cold calls, we have to assume that it's probably not wise to fill up our businesses full of salespeople making cold calls just to give us a sense of busyness or false activity. It seems to be quite obvious there, and this was 8 years ago, that decision makers are kind of not responding to that tactic anymore. Instead, they're actually completing a portion of their buying decision before they contact a vendor. Okay, so they're actually halfway through, or to be more specific, they're 2/3 of the way through their buying decision before they even contact a vendor. Now, their buying decision, it depends on what you sell and who you're selling to and what their process is. It's different for everyone. But if you can imagine that there's a kind of a process of 0 to 100, at what point 100 is when they commit to a buying decision, they're at the 67% before they even speak to you. And that is largely probably doing online research and comparing quotes and finding the information that they need without having to go to a salesperson to obtain it. Okay, so we're talking about internet, and we're talking about technology, referrals, social media, etc. Okay. In those buying decisions, it's no longer a case, or very rarely, unless you're dealing with very, very small businesses, it's very often the case that there's other people involved in that buying decision. So it might be a partner, a spouse, it might be a board of directors. On average, it's about 5.5 people. Okay, 5.5 people are involved in any one buying decision. So right the way down to your SME, to your Fortune 100 companies that might have multiple decision makers there, such as procurement, the CEO, the financial chief financial officer, whatever it might be. There's going to be an average of 5 to 6 people involved in that decision. So there's 5 to 6 different decision-making behaviors, different goals, different aspirations, different pain points that we will need to start catering to and be respectful of when going through a buying process. And the last one is that it kind of reflects a little bit more on the second point there about people making their buying decision. They will use social media to find more information on vendors before even contacting them, and that's about 3/4 of people. Okay, so this is where people are checking out your company's Instagram, your company's Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is you might use, or even looking at LinkedIn and looking at you as the representative and kind of checking out your history. Okay, so include yourself in that social media kind of pool, that 75% of the people that you talk to, when they decide to contact a vendor, 3 out of 4 of them have already done a degree of research using social media. Okay, so there are some things that hopefully will just highlight for you some of the key differences. Maybe some of those stats are quite surprising. Maybe some of them you kind of half anticipated when you saw them come up. But I think we would all agree that what you're looking at here is clearly saying to us as salespeople that we need to change from the way that we may have done something in the 70s and 80s. Now, I'm not saying that that training that you may have received from, or that stems back there doesn't have a place in sales, but I would say that it's a very much a changing marketplace, and we need to adapt to it. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in a bygone era. So, in order to do that, stats and facts and all the data aside, really what this comes down is communication. And communication is what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. Okay, specifically, we'll look at some things that you can say that are effective, some things that are not effective, etc. But all this communication is going to fall into three brackets. There's three primary forms of communication, or modes of communication, as I like to refer to them. Some are more effective than others. Okay, so however you are communicating with your prospects now, you are likely falling into one of these three modes of communications, I guarantee it. And there has been extensive studies done by behavioral scientists into these three forms of communication, and they specifically looked at careers and professionals that are in a role or an industry where influence and persuasion is quite important. They need to influence and persuade others. So that's everything from teachers and psychologists, philosophers, consultants, lawyers, and of course sales professionals fall into this bracket as well. So they've looked at a whole bunch of people that excel in this arena and looked at what modes of communication are they using and what is more effective. So everything you are about to see right now has been proven by behavioral science in a study done, I think the most recent was 2009 or something like that. So although it was over 10 years ago, it's still pretty recent as far as these kind of studies go. And what they found was that the first mode of communication is something that we refer to as dominance. And dominance is when we seek to, well, it's kind of when we go into output mode. We seek to take control, and we do that by going into output mode. So we start telling people what we think we want them to hear, generally something that backs up our argument or something that, that puts us in a positive light. So we talk at people. We tell them about our features and our benefits, and we'll handle objections, and we will do presentations, whether that be over the phone or face to face, and kind of the old school sales pitch about, listen to me, I want to tell you about my product, my company, and what we do. That is what would fall into the dominance category, when you're just talking. Ironically, that's something we do when we're not feeling too confident. Okay, we go into output mode because we don't like an awkward silence or anything like that. So we tend to talk too much, and we tend to tell people everything about our company, hoping that some of it sticks. Okay, doesn't mean you're aggressive, doesn't mean you're obnoxious or loud or rude or anything, but it does mean that you're kind of seeking to take control of the conversation purely by telling people stuff. And according to behavioral science, this is the least persuasive form of communication. So if you're doing any of those things there on the left, be aware that this is the least persuasive form of communication. I thought I'd let that sink in for a little bit. So how can we change that? Well, the next form of communication is something we call discussion. And in discussions, or sometimes we call it debate, we bring questioning into the mix. Okay, so we start to bring in questioning, where we can start to ask questions to our prospects, and then we kind of retort back with our own argument. And that's kind of where debate falls into this category as well. So if you've ever watched a program called The Big Question, I think it's called, or something along those lines, there's a few of these programs about. They'll have a studio audience split down the middle, and they'll present a sort of ethical, moral argument or something about current affairs, and you'll have half the room that will be in favor of whatever the topic is, and half the room that aren't. And what I find, and what you might find as well, is that as they argue the points for and against, you almost find yourself backing each side at one point or another. Okay, or you might find yourself doing this, and it's because the opposition they'll acknowledge the argument that's been presented, and then they will retort with their argument to overcome it. And it's this acknowledgement of the other side, or the other view or opinion, the other person, that makes discussion more persuasive than a sales pitch. Okay, so this is more persuasive than that straight up sales pitch. Not the most persuasive form of communication, but it is kind of better than just pitching someone if you get into a discussion or a debate with them, okay, even if it's a debate. So this is where consultative selling kind of stemmed from, okay. But if we want to know what is the most powerful form of communication when it comes to influence and persuasion, it's something known as dialogue. Okay, something known as a dialogue, and a dialogue stems back thousands of years. Okay, hence why the image there of the chap on the right. His name was Socrates. Okay, and a name that you might be familiar with. So Socrates pioneered the art of dialogue. Okay, he was able to persuade anyone, almost anyone. So naturally, he was a teacher, he was a philosopher, and at one point he was called the most dangerous man in all of the Greek world. We're going back to ancient Greece, about 3,000-4,000 years ago. He was named the most dangerous man in all of the Greek world because of his ability to persuade people, and of course that put him in an enormous position of influence. And he could influence anybody to do anything. Here's the thing though, he never actually told them what they should do. He never said what he felt or what he thought or tried to advise them. Instead, he used a systematic process or a systematic method of questioning to allow the person to persuade themselves. Okay, ultimately he was assassinated for this, so that shows you how kind of powerful it was. But ultimately, the people who were being persuaded weren't actually being persuaded by Socrates. They were actually being persuaded by themselves. And according to behavioral science, this is the most persuasive form of communication. If you can get people to persuade themselves, their thoughts will always be more powerful than anything you can say or do. Okay, so I'd like you to think now about maybe some of the techniques or strategies or conversations that you've been having in your sales career, and thinking about kind of what bracket do I fall in. And some of you might find that you're guilty of falling into dominance more often than you would like. Some of you may wish to be in that discussion and debate arena and find yourself flapping between the two. Some of you may be there, and some of you might not know. Some of you might be, batting from one to another and showing a bit of inconsistency. So we will be looking at dialogue. Not today. We won't be looking at like the system of dialogue today, but we will be revisiting it. And I just want you to be aware of what mode of communication you're in, so that you can shift and move, ideally up a level, when you're ready to. Okay. So now I want to move on to, to help us really move up a gear and move into that discussion, debate, or ideally that dialogue stage. We need to understand some basic principles. Now, what I'm about to share with you is some basic behaviors that you should start to embed in yourself and in your core. And once you start to understand some of these principles, things are going to become a lot easier for you in your sales. Now, some of them are going to be sounding very, very obvious and very, well, I know I should do that. Instead, I want you to take this at a deeper level and actually start to inhibit this as part of your sales persona or your sales personality. And the first one, should you learn nothing else from this session or this coaching session, please take this one away with you, because this is the one that will help to change everything and hopefully springboard all the other lessons and learnings that I'm trying to give to you here. If you can get this, you're going to be halfway there. And it's detachment. Okay, principle one is detachment. Okay, now this is going to be a lot easier said than done. I'll acknowledge that straight away. I'm going to impart some things which, although will make logical sense to you, is going to be quite challenging to do. And unfortunately, I can't teach you how to be detached. It's a feeling that you kind of have to feel, but you need to be aware of it and think about how you can start to feel detached. And what do I mean by detached? Well, I really mean being removed emotionally from the expectation of making a sale. So detach yourself right now from the expectation of making sales. Seems really counterintuitive, I know. Okay, especially when sales has historically been a very goal-orientated industry. We set targets, we set goals, we try and get ourselves pumped up and motivated. I'm going to suggest you lose all of that. Not that you become demotivated, of course, but you start detaching yourself from any expectation of making a sale, and instead place that focus on whether there is a sale to be made in the first place. Okay, so if you need a goal before every call, you need some sort of agenda or some sort of target or outcome, whatever terminology you use. Stop making it about the sale or the meeting or sending out a quote or whatever your agenda is, and start placing that focus on discovering whether there is a sale to be made in the first place, which is really something that we call qualifying. Just think about qualifying the opportunity. Is there a sale to be made here in the first place? And you'll find that you won't make a sale on every call, and I think most of you know that. So by attaching yourself to the expectation of making sales, you're kind of doing two things. One, you're going to come across in a way that is out to get your own agenda. You're going to come across in a way that is just goal orientated and thinking about me, me, me. And your prospects will latch onto that, and it will do you more harm than good, because they'll see it and it will give that uneasy feeling. So it's actually going to cause most of your sales to go cold, because they can see that you're kind of got an agenda. And secondly, as we know, we won't make a sale on every call. Even the best salespeople won't make a sale on every call. By emotionally attaching ourselves to an expectation that we will, we kind of just end up disappointing ourselves. Okay, so I'm not suggesting you be glass half empty, but I am suggesting that if your expectations are so high that you are trying to set yourself an outcome before you get on the call, you're like, yeah, I'm going to make a sale, I'm going to get a meeting or whatever. The best that can happen is that you meet those expectations. And that's not really a great feeling as such. But quite often we might find that we're not meeting those expectations, and that can cause us a bit of stress and anxiety and worry and self-doubt, and those are emotions which have no place in our industry. Okay, so if you take nothing else away from this today, please remember on your next sales meeting, your next sales call, to start trying to detach yourself from any expectation of making the sale. Simply just don't care to some degree. Now, I'm not saying that in a literal sense, but if you can start to inhibit a kind of state of mind that it's okay if I don't get a sale, it doesn't really matter. It's not meant to be. It's kind of a state of mind that I want you to start inhibiting, and you will see how you respond differently to prospects, and as such how they will respond differently to you. So I can't teach you how to do this, but I can give a testimony to how powerful this is. So principle number 2, and this really kind of falls on the back of principle number 1. If we're going to start detaching ourselves from our own expectations of booking meetings and getting sales and closing deals, instead we can focus that attachment on helping others to find and solve their problems. So from now on, guys, this is your new agenda. Behind every sales call, meeting or interaction you have, you are going to be focused solely on helping others to find and solve their problems. Now, on the surface, it might seem pretty obvious, and you're like, well, yeah, I kind of do that, Rob. That's kind of my job, and I always try and do that. But I want you to look at the sentence again. It's helping others to find and solve their problems. Okay, helping others. So quite often in sales, we're taught that we should be solving problems. We should be solving problems for our clients. We contact clients, we ask them some surface questions, we try to dig, hoping that a prospect will come out with, yeah, we do have a problem with X or Y, and we can go, I can fix that, I have the solution for you, and that will stick. And I would suggest that does work, and if you're fortunate enough to find customers who have those problems, then great, it's wonderful. That's kind of what an average salesperson does, is they will solve problems. But a good salesperson is a problem finder. A problem finder, someone who can, in partnership, if you will, or in collaboration with their prospect, help find problems in a business that the prospect didn't even know they had. That is powerful. And that is what will set you apart from the product pushers that are out there that are constantly just kind of trying to jam the solution down the throat. Now, I'm not suggesting that you create problems that don't exist, But if you're having a conversation with a prospect and they have a moment of insight where they realize, boy, I've actually got a problem in my business, I didn't realize, and you were the person that helped them achieve that level of insight, that is when you can truly call yourself an expert in your field or a trusted advisor, whatever it is that you kind of want to be positioned in your industry, that go-to person, because you're the person who can truly be consultative and help them find problems. And then it only makes logical sense that you're well positioned to then present in a way that, you know, is appropriate, a solution for those problems. Okay, so how do we find problems with our prospects? Okay, well, we need to really understand first, how does your product and service actually help my customers? How does your product and service actually help my customers? So this isn't what you do, this isn't your service, this isn't your product, it's not even your solution. It's really about thinking about the problems that your customers generally have. What problem does my product and service actually solve? And it's either going to remove pain or it's going to promote pleasure. And by that, I mean it's going to help a business achieve a goal. Okay, so some businesses are about problems and fixing problems and pain points and that's all well and good. Some businesses are actually more goal orientated. They'll put up with a problem if it's not too big a deal, right? And to expand upon that, we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. So during our conversation, this is asking ourselves questions internally. So these aren't questions for your prospects. You wouldn't ask these questions to your prospects really, but you would check in with yourself while you're engaging in a customer conversation or while you're going through that process. And you kind of want to have an agreement that first, the prospect has a problem with their current situation. Okay, so that sounds pretty obvious. Does the prospect have a problem with their current situation? Yes or no? If they don't, it's not going to be a sale, and I suggest you move on. But providing that they do have a problem with their situation, then we can move on to the next question, just to ask ourselves, which is, does the prospect have a problem with their current situation and a desire to change it? Because as I said a few minutes ago, some people will have problems with their situation, with their business, with their personal lives even, and they're not really a big a deal. They're kind of, it's not a priority for them right now. If you get people that kind of don't have a desire to change it and that you try to force them to change it, you kind of get procrastination here. You get the I'll think about it, or call us back, or whatever it might be, because they've got no real motivation or sense of urgency to change it. Okay, so they need to have a desire to change their situation, otherwise you kind of just beating your head against a brick wall. So let's assume that they have a problem and they have a desire to change that problem. Your third and final question you should be asking yourself is, can my product and service genuinely help that prospect to change the situation, to change that situation? Because if you can't, then you're not a good fit. Okay, and your course of action there is probably to either come up with a bespoke service that, if you can, of course, but if their problem is something that is way out of your remit, refer them to someone else and, you know, cash in some brownie points. You never know how they might help you. But to kind of, if you find somebody who has a problem, a genuine desire to change it, and you sell them something that won't help them, you're actually going to cause yourself a whole lot of pain, because now you're going to have to account manage that individual, and it's probably going to, you know, that's actually how you get poor reviews, by providing a poor service, right? It's better at that point to just admit to the client that, yeah, it sounds like you've got a problem here. Unfortunately, I don't think that's something I can help with, but hey, let me refer you to someone, okay? And at least you can maybe, you know, signpost them to a third party and you know, and do your bit there. But certainly don't try to, you know, jam a square peg into a round hole. Okay, so provided that those 3 questions that you ask yourself result in a yes, you should be able or positioned to then engage a customer and start talking about those solutions. Okay, so ask skilled questions. Okay, and that's something we'll be covering in future training sessions. Questions, of course, will get answers. You'll listen for the answers and what those answers mean, and we'll be expanding on that in a moment. But then most people stop there. And really what the modern day salesperson should be looking to do is to then ask even more questions. Okay, asking questions about their answers, in fact, what their responses are, because that allows you to go deeper into a conversation. Now, I hate this cliche, but sales is kind of like an onion. It has layers, and the idea is that we don't just settle for a surface answer and just take what they say at face value and then try and jam a solution to their response. What we should be doing is really investigating what their answers mean and going deeper, peeling back those layers, going deeper, so we reach really the core of the problem. Because once you start peeling back those layers, you start becoming deeper ingrained in their business and their world, much more than your competitors, much more than other salespeople who are just kind of asking, like leading questions and then trying to present and pitch their product. If you can really get a prospect thinking about the deepest level of their problems, the symptoms, the causes, a bit like a doctor, really. It's very much like a doctor. It's another analogy that's been used 100 times. If you went to a doctor and said, I've got a pain in my knee, and he gave you medicine, okay, you'd probably be a bit skeptical. What a doctor will do, or a proper doctor will do, is they'll ask, well, can you describe the pain, and when did it start, and how long has it been going on for, and is there pain anywhere else, and what have you tried? They'll ask questions, and they'll have what is really a dialogue, a genuine dialogue, about then finding out as much as they can, so that when they present their solution, you have faith that it's going to work. Okay, if they tell you to take a medicine or apply a gel, whatever, you've kind of sold on the idea that it's going to work, right? So on that, we want to then start looking at questions. The third principle is to ask the right questions at the right time. So we will be covering the power of questions over and over and over again. Okay, questions are incredibly powerful, and for a number of reasons. They will gather, analyze, and diagnose, very much like the doctor analogy I just used there. Okay, they will gather information for you to be able to understand really what's going on, and in doing so, you are actually in control of the conversation. Okay, so he who asks questions is actually the person in control of the conversation, because you can steer someone's thoughts by doing that. If you're just talking at someone, people might, their mind might wander. Maybe your mind is wandering now because I'm talking, your mind is wandering. But if I were to be speaking to you on a one-to-one basis and I asked you a question, I can kind of direct your attention to where I want it to be. Okay, so not only does it put me in control of the conversation, but it actually involves the other person. Okay, it involves them, and it makes them feel like there's a collaborative effort here, and when they're involved in the discussion, they start taking ownership of the problems, and then they start taking ownership of finding a solution. Okay, and it starts to become their problem a bit more. They can't put it off anymore because they've started thinking about it and contributing to the discussion, if that makes any sense to you. As a result, asking questions will always create value in you and what you sell, but more importantly, this is where dialogue starts, because it will internally persuade your prospect. You will start to internally persuade your prospect with the right questions, of course, at the right time. They will be able to overcome their own concerns, they'll be able to come to their own conclusions, and they'll be able to make decisions, and they'll basically be able to commit themselves. And that's really what we're looking for that commitment at the end of the sales cycle. But they'll be committing themselves rather than, like you closing them. Okay, so the right questions at the right time, and this is something that we'll continue to look at over the next few sessions. That said, questions are all well and good, but you really do need to learn what is probably one of the most important life skills that I can ever share with you, which is listening to what people mean. And that means not just what they say, okay? Not just taking what they say at face value and believing it, but being able to challenge what they might say, or being able to acknowledge or expand or delve deeper into some of the responses that they're getting, rather than just being like a yes man. And this is a skill known as active listening. Okay. Now you might be surprised to know that 60% of the time, according to behavioral science, this is 60% of the time that we are supposed to be listening to someone, we're thinking about what we're going to say next. That's more than half the time, right? And then another third of the time, we're actually waiting for the gap in the conversation to say it. Now, I know that I've done this. I don't know as I do it 60-30% of the time. This is an average on behavioral science. But I know I've certainly been guilty of asking a question and then having like a little thought pop into my head, think, oh, I'm going to say this next because that's going to be really, really good. And before I know it, maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds has gone by. and I've kind of missed what's been said, and for all I know it could have been something really, really important and key, and I've just tuned out. Didn't mean to, didn't do it on purpose, it's just one of those things that happen. But active listening, unfortunately, is a skill that we can learn, we can strengthen, and we can hone. And there's really 4 skills that will make you a powerful active listener. Okay, skill number 1, be present. Being present means being in the moment, being there and giving your full attention to the person that you are dealing with. This is a lot easier to evidence when you're in front of someone because you can look interested and you can give them your attention. Over the phone, it's a bit more difficult to prove that you're being present, but do it nonetheless. Block out all the noise around you. You might be in a very noisy office with lots of activity going on. Try to be fully absorbed in the conversation for the 10-15 minutes, however long your conversations go on for. When you start having deep conversations, you know, you might have a half an hour intake call or something like that, but whatever it is, whatever length of time, be in the moment and be absorbed by it, because you will start hearing things in the conversation that you may not have heard before. The list of remarks or comments from your prospect will all of a sudden seem that much louder. So be very much in the moment and present with your clients or your prospects. And also be curious. And by curious, I mean be inquisitive and ask questions as they arise, if they're appropriate, of course. If a prospect says something that you are curious about, then ask a question about it, because you can only unearth more information by digging deeper. And it needs to be a genuine curiosity. You need to this is kind of something I can't really teach you. You've got to be genuinely curious and interested in your prospects. Okay, and if you're not, then you're probably in the wrong industry. But if you are genuinely interested in helping people, then as a byproduct, you should be genuinely curious about what makes them tick, what goes on in their business, what causes them problems, what causes them joy, what causes them success, what causes them failure, and ask these questions where appropriate, and start finding out the whys and the hows and the whats and the whens, and do it with a genuine curiosity. Your third skill of active listening is to be acknowledging. So sometimes in that path of curiosity, we'll uncover things that really just don't really apply to us, and it's not information that we need nor want. But it's important to acknowledge everything that someone says. Now, this doesn't mean by going, yes, I understand, I acknowledge what you've said every 5 seconds, but it does mean in a way that is appropriate for your audience, is to allow the prospect to know that they've been heard and they've been acknowledged. Because there's nothing worse, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, I know I certainly have, of having something to say and it not being acknowledged, it kind of either being ignored or someone coming along and go, yeah, but listen to my day, or whatever it might be. There's nothing worse than feeling unacknowledged. So if you can be the person that acknowledges the contribution of your prospect, you'll be someone that they enjoy talking to. And that is far removed, that is far away from those adjectives that we looked at earlier, like pushy and yuck and dishonest. Okay, you'll be someone that they enjoy listening to. Okay, now if you want to create true value while they enjoy listening to you, you need to show that you're understanding what they're saying. Now this is a bit of a tricky one, because you will never understand wholly how people's problems are affecting them. Okay, you'll never really get there, but we can start to understand. Okay, we can start to understand. We can make an attempt at understanding what it means. And what I refer to here is, if you're in an industry that speaks to a lot of people, and you're probably doing as a sales representative or as a sales executive or whatever role you're in, when you're selling, you're talking to a lot of prospects, you're talking to a lot of clients, and you probably hear a lot of the same things over and over again. And it's very easy to assume that we know what that means every time we hear it, and that's simply not the case. So if you hear, an objection or concern, don't say, oh yeah, I understand completely. Try to understand, ask them what it means, and you'll start to build up an individual understanding, because there's nothing worse than, the only thing worse than not being acknowledged is not being understood, I think, is when you're trying to explain something and someone just doesn't get it, and we don't want to be that person. Okay. And principle number 5, our last one, and this is another one that I think you should, along with detachment, is one that you should really try and store and remember this one, and it's to eliminate sales pressure. Now, obviously, this is something that we always want to do, but you might be surprised to know that a lot of your behaviors are actually triggering the sales pressure. Okay, according to behavioral science, we're actually our own worst enemy in a lot of cases. By using dominance, we actually create objections, we create pressure and resistance by the way that we behave. So we'll be exploring this a lot as well as we move through the sessions. But some tips to help you do that almost immediately is to make sure you deliver your language in a very natural, calm and relaxed tone. Okay, not too excitable, not too fast, not too high pitched, just be very natural, be very, very conversational, I would say, and that will immediately put your prospects at ease. If you're just speaking in a conversational tone, they'll respond in kind. Part of that is slowing down, as I said. So if you slow down your pace, and I normally suggest to my students that they should clock their speed down by about 20%. Okay, because even when we think we're speaking at the right pace, we're probably going a little bit too fast. So if we just clock down our speed by 20%, that generally will sit well in a conversation, okay? Because even the best of us sometimes get excited, get carried away, and we kind of ramp up speed without being aware of it. So 20% clock your speed down. And this one, and you'll hear me say this again and again and again. You guys will be sick of me saying this one, but detach yourself from the expectation of making a sale, because if you can learn to do that, principle number one, and really remove yourself from any expectations of making a sale, you will eliminate sales pressure. If you want to eliminate sales pressure from your prospects, you need to eliminate it from yourself. You need to relieve yourself of that sales pressure, and that really comes with detachment. So as I said before, if you can learn to detach yourself, a lot of these other principles and some of the techniques and skills that we'll look at will become a whole lot easier. Okay, so just focus on finding and solving problems, if any exist, and if they don't, that's cool as well. So you need to be cool with that. All right. So now that we've gone over some of the principles of sales, and hopefully you can start to think about those, think about the power of questions, think about helping others find their problems, not you just solving them, but more importantly, think about detachment and how it will help you reduce and eliminate sales pressure for your prospects, because they're some of the biggest takeaways I'd like you to take away from this session. And I think to help you do that, it might be useful to look at some myths about selling that you've probably heard. Maybe you even told other people, maybe you even believe them. But some of the things you would all have heard of these at some point or another in your sales career. And I would like to suggest that what you're about to see, these things just simply aren't true. And they're certainly not relevant in today's age, and they won't be in the forthcoming years, okay? Because as we've already explored and understood, that the sales arena has changed and is continuing to evolve. So from now on, if ever you hear any of the following statements, you can kind of give a little chuckle to yourself, because you know that they're simply kind of not effective in today's market. The first one, this is a classic: selling is a numbers game. Selling is a numbers game. So you've all heard this one at no point, and you probably hear it when you're not doing very well. So I'll share with you the story about how this myth came to be. I think we're going back into the 60s. There was a sales manager of an automotive company who was having a sales team have a struggling week or month, whatever. They just weren't hitting their sales targets. And in order to make them feel better, he said, just keep on the phones, guys. Selling is a numbers game. So he made it up. He made it up to make his sales team feel better when they weren't performing. And unfortunately, we still do this 60 years on. Is that rather than look at the skills that we need to become more effective at sales, or looking at better strategies or processes, there are still sales managers and companies that enforce this mantra upon their salespeople to make them just do more of the same thing. Now, the really scary thing about this is there is an element of truth in it, in the sense that if you do keep on doing activity and you do keep throwing mud at a wall, some of it will stick. And that's generally when people celebrate. They're having a really, really hard month, so they continue making sales calls. Their sales manager says, keep going, selling is a numbers game. And then they get a sale. And that's probably the worst thing that can happen, because it then reinforces this idea that selling is a numbers game. And the salesman turns around and says, see, I told you it's a numbers game. Now, I don't know about you, but if I try something 1,000 times and I fail 999 times, I hate to be the pessimist, but I still see that as a little bit of a failure. And I know there's, who was it, Edison, who said, I found 1,001 ways of not lighting a light bulb, whatever. But the thing about numbers game, or the law of averages, mathematically there is a principle there that if you do enough activity, you'll get more results. But it only works if the activity is right, if the skills are there, if your process is right. Then you can scale up and call it a numbers game. But if you're working with a broken tool or a broken process, it's just going to create you a sense of activity. You're going to burn out, and it's just not pleasant for anyone. Okay, so take that one with a pinch of salt. Next time someone says to you selling is a numbers game, start to challenge that. It's only a numbers game if you're not doing something right, in my opinion. Okay. With that comes rejection as part of sales. So this is something else that we're often told to make us feel better. But here's the thing: is rejection is an emotion, right? We feel rejected, and it's not something that's pleasant. We're not wired as a species to really enjoy rejection, and we never will be. So while we're told just to accept it and to lap it up, it just doesn't sit well with us naturally. Okay, just to be told that rejection is part of sales. And I don't care how thick-skinned you think you are, if somebody does reject you, then you feel rejected, and it's as simple as that, and it's not a nice feeling. Now, here's the thing: is that we know logically that our customers are not rejecting us as people. It's not actually personal. They might be rejecting your product, they might be rejecting your company, they might just be rejecting you on a knee-jerk basis that you've called at the wrong time, or they're sick of it, salespeople having a bad day. But here's the thing: if you really want to learn how to deal with rejection, it comes back to detachment. Okay, because you can only be rejected when you have when you're anticipating a result, when you're anticipating something, or expecting, for that matter, expecting a result or something to happen. We get our hopes up, and then they get shot down, and that's what rejection is. Okay, it's when we're trying to project an agenda or some idea. We have some blueprint of what a sales call should go like, and it doesn't happen that way. That's rejection. If you are truly detached and at peace and present in the moment, you won't feel rejected. I'm not saying that you won't have people say no to you, or you won't find a customer who's not a good fit or not ready, or I'm not saying that. These things will still happen, but you won't feel rejected, and I think that's the most important thing. This one's a favorite of mine: is to be enthusiastic about your product or service, to be excitable, to smile while you dial. Motion creates emotion. All these kind of cliches are used to get people hyped up and excited about what they sell. When you call someone and you are overly excited about the product that you sell, it comes across as fake. It comes across as disingenuous. Even if you do, I'm not saying you shouldn't believe in your product and service. Quite the opposite. You should believe in your product and service, and I suppose you should be excited about what you do and how you can help people. But I would urge you to curb your enthusiasm. Just because you are excited doesn't mean the other person should be. And this comes from someone who worked in health and safety, right? Now, I worked in health and safety, and I can tell you that health and safety is not exciting. Health and safety people do not get excited by health and safety. So if I was to call up, and I would be cold calling, prospecting, and I'm trying to sound, ecstatic over the new risk assessment forms that come out, it's just not going to be genuine. Instead, curb your enthusiasm, lower your tone, stop with that. How are you today? Isn't it great? And this is amazing. Stop with that cheesiness. It sounds fake. Instead, be calm and relaxed and conversational. And I think if your enthusiasm is genuine about your product and service, or you genuinely believe it, it will come out in the substance of what you say. Okay, so really try to not look like that guy on the right there. That's pretty frightening. Well, another big myth is that you must assume the sale. So assumptive selling has been about for ages, that we think that if we just powerhouse through a sale and we try to close people and assume and try and make them do something they don't want to just by, powering through and waiting for them to say no. Unfortunately, customers are more comfortable saying no to us now, or more comfortable certainly with the I'll think about it and not going ahead, but it simply won't work. You can't bully people into sales, nor should you. And if you assume that they're ready to go ahead, you'll make yourself look very silly when they don't. If you assume anything really about their problems as well, you kind of make yourself look like the image on the right. We should stop being assumptive about people's problems, people's solutions, about people's readiness or commitment to go ahead. Instead, we should be asking open, dialogue-led questions to help them close and commit themselves. So if you are assumptive, that you're just going in using assumptive selling techniques to try and close the deal, I would urge that it's probably going to do you more harm than good. Okay. And following on the back of that is one of my favorites, because this one's been around for ages. This is the last myth of today's session, and it's what we call the ABC of closing, or the ABC of sales, sorry, which is always be closing. And this is typically used to urge salespeople to always be pushing for a sale or a meeting, or to be pushing for the next step. Now, this one's, again, a tricky one, because there is an element of truth in the way that we should always be looking to advance a sales engagement to the next stage. We don't want to leave things open-ended, but to always be closing. People have taken this literally, and they'll ask for the sale, or they'll use closing techniques over and over and over again until something works. It's a bit like a numbers game. Always be doing it, and eventually something will happen. So something interesting about this this myth, as you'll see the image on the right, this came from a film called Glengarry Glen Ross back in the 80s, which is a good film. It stars Alec Baldwin as a sales manager who's training his sales team to always be closing. But what a lot of people don't know about this film is that this film is based off a play called Death of a Salesman. Now, just think about that title for a moment, Death of a Salesman, which was written in the, I think it was about the 70s or 80s. A play was written called Death is a Salesman. And what the play was about, and what Glengarry Glen Ross is about as well, it's actually a comedy taking the mickey out of the stereotypical salesperson. So it's actually taking the mickey out of these kinds of stereotypes of people who are always closing and using cheesy tactics. And this was back in the 80s. People acknowledged that this is a stereotype. It's a parody or a satire. I can't quite think of the word, but it's certainly not trying to portray salespeople in a glamorous light. But unfortunately, sales managers and leaders loved the film Glengarry Glen Ross, and they found it empowering. It's a bit like Wolf of Wall Street. It was the Wolf of Wall Street of its day, where it kind of was trying to glamorize, and it got completely taken the wrong way. So this is actually a bit of a piss take into sales, and yet it's found its way into sales training manuals and sales books, and people believe that always be closing is actually sound business or sound sales practice advice, and I would consider it's not, and it never was. It was supposed to be a joke, and yet some salespeople have taken it seriously, which I find quite amusing. Okay, so that really concludes the sales myths and the training, really. So we've looked at some of the things that maybe you've heard and believed, and we've looked at some of the principles that you should be adopting instead, and we looked at some of the modes of communication, and that really all stemmed from understanding how sales has evolved, and with it the psychology of the modern day customer. And so I hope that you've taken something away from this that will help you become a better salesperson in your next sales engagement. Whether that be being that bit more detached, whether it might be asking those few more questions, whether it be whatever it might be, active listening, whatever it is that you've taken away from here, I hope it helps you in your next sales conversation. As we move through this Wednesday webinar series, we'll be looking at some actual techniques and strategies, as well as exploring the psychology of sales a little bit further. This kind of embeds and spans across all the coaching sessions. So we'll be looking, hopefully, to piece by piece put together the puzzle of what the modern day salesperson or modern day effective salesperson should be doing and behaving like. And so therefore I hope this has been useful. You can obviously download this and rewind it and watch it as many times as you like, and I hope you you do so where you find that it's appropriate. In the meantime, I want you to have meaningful conversations, make a difference, and most importantly, have fun. Okay, so until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you on the next series. Ta-ra.